I'm here to talk to you today, Professor Thapar, about your work into child and adolescent psychiatry, and in particular ADHD and the links to genetic risk factors. So my interest stems from the fact that I have a daughter with quite extreme ADHD, and I think, like many parents, I've got so many questions about it. And I've also asked my daughter what would she really like to ask, so I've come armed with hundreds of questions from her as well. How would you define ADHD? Because I have an idea in my head from watching my daughter's behaviour, and that she has a few friends with ADHD as well. And what's the sort of clinical definition? What do you look for?
It's defined by very severe, extreme problems with concentration, and which are out of proportion to the child's age or developmental level. Then hyperactivity, motor activity, or when they're older, more restlessness. And then the third feature is impulsiveness, doing things without really thinking, saying things without thinking. And these symptoms have got to be very severe, and also they have to be present in more than one setting. So it's not just at home, it will be present in school or in other sorts of contexts. And the symptoms are severe enough that they're interfering with function. So, for example, academic achievement relative to intelligence, social relationships. So it hasn't, the symptoms have an impact.
Across the board. Yeah.
So, and the other issue is that the onset is early. So by definition, the onset is in early childhood.
How do you see it in a toddler? If you, a parent, came to you and said, I'm a bit worried my child has ADHD, do you just see it in that they can't play in a constructive fashion very early on? How does it manifest itself, say, in an 18-month-old baby or a 2-year-old? Do you start to see it as early as that?
It's rare to get a referral preschool, and one would want to be cautious about diagnosing ADHD in a toddler because there is such a huge variability at that age. But when a child reaches school age, and it's much more clear-cut that this isn't just, a sort of extreme normal variation, but it is ADHD. The typical pattern that's described is that there was severe behavioural disruption because of the concentration difficulties, and typically doesn't have the normal pattern of play. So typically children aged 2 and 3 will settle down to play with with certain toys, and the typical pattern for ADHD is that the child will flit from toy to toy, no matter what sorts of things are purchased, and there may be a range of toys available, but that sort of ability to concentrate and settle and play is absent.
Yeah. My daughter suffers frustration and anger, and is that a common trait amongst people with ADHD?
Yes. So again, this has been quite a recent area of research, and in fact some of the people who work in my group are looking at this. The anger and irritability, which is, we're not sure what that means in the long term. That's still an area of research, but we know that it's certainly troublesome for individuals and for families as a kind of day-to-day difficulty, that kind of irritability and anger. I mean, there's a paper that's just come out this year that suggested that actually when the ADHD is treated, for example, with medication, that also impacts on the anger and irritability.
Our experience was that it was mellowed. In my case, my daughter was adopted, so she came to me when she was 6.5 years old, which is quite old, and then went all the way through primary school. And it was obvious to me as a parent that she really, really couldn't concentrate. And we have 2 adopted daughters, full sisters, and it was slightly different to the younger daughter. I could see this lack of concentration more extreme than in my younger daughter. And at the time, I kept talking to the school about it, and I kept saying, I think there's something really different about my child. And a number of explanations were put forward along the one person thought she had mild epilepsy, and the concentration was just literally, she really was absent in certain times. She was watched by an education psychologist who just said, oh no, she's fine, she's just a bit dreamy. And it was only when we finally got a referral to the Maudsley when she was 13 that she was diagnosed with ADHD, and it was quite an eye-opener. And very important for me as a parent to have that diagnosis, because I could see her lack of concentration was holding her back. And so you keep trying to help a child and say, well, if you could just concentrate a little more. But of course, once you realise actually she really can't, it's a real challenge for her. It helps you try and help her better. In your experience, do you think there's underdiagnosis of ADHD in this country, and do you think there are different experiences internationally?
Actually, there's been quite a lot of research done in this area, and in the UK and so far in other European countries, the pattern is one of underdiagnosis. So people have looked at the rate of ADHD just generally in the population, and then the rate at which it's picked up in clinics and treated, and basically there's a gap. So that's one issue. The second issue is that whilst ADHD more commonly affects boys, girls still get affected, and it is picked up less easily less readily in girls. So for example, the sort of gender ratio in the general population is for every 3 to 4 boys affected, there'll be 1 girl, but in clinics, the ratio then gets amplified, so it's 7 to 8 boys to 1 girl. However, the patterns of underdiagnosis and overdiagnosis aren't the same across the world. So studies that have come out in the United States have shown a different pattern, where they have some areas where there's underdiagnosis, but there are also areas where there is overdiagnosis.
And long term, how do you manage this condition? What do you do as you go into adulthood? And because I'm aware of some parents saying to me, well, my daughter or my son in particular has calmed down a lot, actually, as they got into their late 20s or so. It doesn't seem to be the case for my daughter, and I wondered what are the long-term things you can do to help yourself?
I mean, I think this is a really important question. Previously, people used to think that neurodevelopmental disorders like ADHD and autism were limited to childhood, and that people would grow out of ADHD. But there's been a number of studies now that have followed children into the teenage years and into adult life, and shown that actually, whilst some people show improvements in terms of at least their overactivity and impulsiveness, the concentration problems tend to remain. And there is huge variability in outcome, but nevertheless, compared to the general population, I mean, there's been a study now that's followed up people into midlife. There are more continued difficulties with concentration. It's more challenging in terms of work and social relationships and romantic relationships. It's more, you know, there are also more risks, for example, of antisocial behaviour, criminal behaviour in some, and in some people, mood disorders. I mean, it is a chronic disorder, but I think probably, you know, like many chronic medical disorders like diabetes, it's a question of attempting to control it, and the way that it's best managed will change over time, and certainly there are people who can get niches in terms of occupation or you know, have, you know, satisfying relationships, but it is of course challenging because it needs to be, you know, managed even in young adulthood. And actually research has shown that that transition from sort of child and adolescence to adulthood in terms of services and management is quite a challenge for, you know, for most countries, because I think there was this belief that people would grow out of it. At the end of the day, it's an impairment, and I think trying to sort of find niches and shape the environment around the person is really important. I mean, we don't think twice about doing that for a physical disability, yes, making, you know, wheelchair access, and I think, well, I do think that in terms of educational and occupational, chances that one way we need to do is actually mould situations in a way that are well adapted for the person who's got these difficulties. And also then I think the young person needs help in being able to select appropriate niches as well.
Can you talk a little bit, presumably it's a mix of genes. Can you talk a little bit about the genetic element of it?
Okay, so I mean, most disorders in medicine are what are called complex disorders, and ADHD is one of them. So by complex disorders, that we mean that it's not explained by one gene or one environmental risk factor. But as I said, that applies to disorders such as diabetes or asthma. You've got multiple genes involved. So that's the first thing. It isn't just easy to work out, who might be at risk. The other issue is that it isn't explained entirely by genes. So there are non-genetic factors as well, environmental risks. So
what are those environmental risks, though?
Well, it's interesting. We've come quite a long way in terms of understanding about the genetics, but it really has been hard to work out what those environmental risk factors are. We believe that they're likely to be important in the prenatal, early postnatal period because it's an early onset disorder. There's been lots of risk factors which have been looked at, for example, biological toxins in the environment.
What does that mean? What's a biological? I mean, is it car fumes? I don't know.
Like lead exposure, chemical exposure. There's also been a link with prematurity, low birth weight. The problem is it's very difficult to show what definitely causes ADHD. So at the moment, for example, like in medicine, we know that smoking causes lung cancer. We don't have that definite causal evidence because lots of risks that people are exposed to, they're not random. It could just be some sort of selection factor as to where you live, or because maybe a parent has got a particular genetic makeup, they engage in certain behaviours in pregnancy. So it's actually really difficult to know what those environmental risk factors are that cause ADHD. We haven't got a firm handle on them. We know that there must be environmental factors, but we don't know what they are.
So the question my daughter has, I mean, she's keen to have children, and she wants to know if any child she has will have ADHD. And what are the risk factors for her?
ADHD is like most common complex diseases, like disorders like diabetes. What family studies have shown that the rate is going to be higher than children of someone else. So she does need to be aware of it, and of course you need to be aware of the heightened risk, but at the same time it's not inevitable because it isn't just one explanatory factor.
It's interesting as well because I think some of your research has highlighted that the genetic, if you like, pattern might be quite similar for people on the whole spectrum to schizophrenia and autism. Is that right? How would you phrase that? How do you see is there a genetic link between those mental disorders as well?
Yeah, and the overlap with ADHD and autism is clinically very, very strong. So a lot of children with ADHD have autism and vice versa, or they'll have autistic type features. The link with later schizophrenia is rare. However, what we've found is that at a genetic and biological overlap, these brain disorders, there is a substantial overlap between ADHD, schizophrenia and autism. So certainly at a brain and genetic level, there is a lot of...
How do you find that? Do you take, these are really ignorant questions, but do you take a blood sample and find something? Do you do a brain scan? How do you isolate the gene? Just tell me a bit more about the practical way that you find this out.
So there's lots of different ways that we can look at genetics. So you can do this by essentially looking at groups of relatives, people who are biologically related, not biologically related, and differ in the amount that they're genetically related. So that would be, so for example, those would be like family, twin and adoption studies, and that's where you indirectly look at the genetic contribution. And then you've got the direct route where you do take like a blood or a saliva sample, and we look at the genome and we look at where people vary in their genomes, and basically look at those affected versus those are not affected, and look at what variations are more common in people who are affected versus not
Okay.
affected.
So in terms of your studies, because I've read a little bit about the studies with looking at adopted children. Obviously, having an adopted child, I'm quite interested in that. So does that give you a sort of control group, as it were, that you were then allowed to say to measure against people where, you know, their birth children, and perhaps there's that you can see the genes coming through the family? How do adoption studies help you?
So an adoption study design, particularly when children are adopted at birth, can provide a means of looking at the genetic contribution by looking at the similarity of the birth parents and the offspring, and then comparing that with the similarity for a particular disorder of the adoptive family members and who are unrelated to the individual who's been adopted.
Once I'd had my diagnosis for my daughter, then the next question is, what can I do to help her? And this is really hard for a lot of parents, because certainly my daughter went on Ritalin for a year, and her special needs teacher at the school said it transformed her. And for the first time, she really was able to concentrate in class. So how do you help someone? So she's got lots of questions for you on this. So on Ritalin, what she wants to know is, and Concerta, on both those drugs, she could see her concentration improve, and she liked that. But she did find it hard to sleep, and she also felt that she lost her appetite on those. And she feels that it stunted her growth. She feels that taking it at that age meant she's not as tall as she should be. And are those common fears amongst people who take these drugs?
I mean, the medication, as you highlight, does have benefits for those who are severely affected, but like all medications, there are side effects. You know, it's a pharmacological agent, which is why you only want to reserve it for those who have severe symptoms, and so the guidelines are quite clear about reserving it for those with severe ADHD. But there are side effects, amongst them disruption to sleep, loss of appetite, which means that when a child, or in an adult, well, a child really, is on medication, we do have to monitor growth carefully, because growth can be affected due to a lot, and it's explained by the loss of appetite. However, studies show that once the medication is stopped, or there's a break given, that there's catch-up growth.
Yeah.
So the evidence so far doesn't suggest there's any eventual impact on, the eventual height, but there are side effects. So there is this balance between benefits and risks, as there are for any medication.
As a parent, you're trying to weigh all this up and what's best for your child. And I think certainly with ADHD, I felt it's an area where you're judged quite harshly. So in one sense, I was lucky, if I could put it that way, in that she was an adopted child. So no one said, oh, well, she can't concentrate because of the way you've brought her up, because that sort of got me off that hook. But I was conscious of other parents I know who have children with ADHD who felt very judged, that their children's behaviour was their fault. And then secondly, when we put her on Ritalin, then we were very judged. And people felt we were doing the wrong thing, that it was almost like using a drug, when in fact there were other things that we should be doing. Now, do you feel that this area is an area where parents are often put under the microscope in a way that perhaps they wouldn't be with a condition like diabetes or something else?
Yes. I think it is a real issue, and as I said, one doesn't likely consider medication, but in those with severe true ADHD, there is a lot of research evidence showing medication is effective, and certainly in Europe the guidelines are use medication judiciously for those with severe ADHD, and use it in combination with other strategies as well, say schooling, support, other sorts of interventions.
So sometimes I feel when I talk to people about it, it's as if by having the diagnosis, they feel I'm making excuses for my daughter, that somehow I'm looking for a reason that she behaves like this, and to give an excuse. And whereas I think, as a parent, what I'm trying to do is to really understand her and to understand the difference between can't and won't, which is such an important distinction for me. And do you feel that when your experience as a clinician that this is an important distinction for other parents, because you then know how to judge these children?
Yes. I think that's, I mean, what you're describing is a really common misunderstanding, the belief that ADHD is the same as behavioural problems. And again, there's lots of research evidence showing they're not. So, for example, in the last 50 years, research, in fact, undertaken by one of my colleagues here, looked at the rate of different mental health problems in children over time. Now, the rate of behavioural problems has gone up over time in the general population. The rate of ADHD, this is in the general population, has actually stayed the same. They're not the same. The causes of behavioural problems, we've shown there's really good evidence of, for example, from a study showing that poverty, family adversity, parenting have got causal effects on behavioural problems. They haven't been shown for ADHD.
Yeah, it's a totally different
they are different.
It was before we had her diagnosis, when we went to the GPs, they said, we described her symptoms to the GP and so on. They just said, well, she's just got behavioural problems and that's nothing to do with us. And I think that's the problem for a lot of parents of ADHD children. They're being lumped as having behavioural issues, and it's quite different.
Yes.
One of the things that worries me is that without support, certainly a lot of her friends, because we do know other families with children with ADHD, and quite a few of her friends do come from quite disadvantaged families as well, and she understands them, I think, because she had 6 years of a very disadvantaged background. Is there a link between young men in particular ending up in the criminal justice system because they're compulsive and unable to always to manage their emotions? And again, that has to be of concern if we are really criminalising something that's a condition.
Yes. Unfortunately, there is evidence to suggest that. So studies of prison inmates have shown unrecognised ADHD and autism, in fact.
Right. And the final question I wanted to ask you is, are you optimistic about the future for people with ADHD?
We've got an awful long way to go, but I am optimistic. I'm optimistic in the sense that I don't think it's something we can help with by just engaging in opinionated debate. Everyone has their opinion, and the only way you're going to challenge opinion is by actually creating evidence, which is why I'm really feel passionate about the science. You have to do the research, you have to demonstrate things empirically and then put that evidence there. And I really think that that's what's going to help.
Yes, and as a clinician, I mean, presumably you try and bring your research to bear on your patients, but for example, people living elsewhere in the country, or how do you spread best practice?
I mean, I think that's a challenge for all people who are doing research on neurodevelopmental disorders, mental health disorders. How do we make sure that the research findings actually get translated into practice and also actually influence services and, well, I guess doing these sorts of things, doing these sorts of things, highlighting the research. I think also arming families with information. I think as scientists, I'm a scientist and a clinician, you can do a lot to help, but I also think we have to actually arm affected individuals and also families affected, because everyone has to try and raise awareness and increase understanding, and I think hopefully in that way we'll be able to influence what's actually happening in terms of services.
Okay, well, thank you very much for answering all my questions. It's really helpful, and I think it's just given me a much stronger understanding of that distinction between ADHD as a condition and people with behavioural issues, because in my life they've been very lumped together very unhelpfully, so thank you.